So how do we measure that? Well, first we have to decide what we're going to measure. What's the average level of prices? So typically, the average level of prices that you'll see measured on the front pages of, newspapers is what's called based on the Consumer Price Index. So the Consumer Price Index is a measure put out by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, whose job it is to go and try to estimate an inflation rate for Australia. So they make up the CPI, not because they're actually interested in the CPI, but because they want some measure of inflation, the rate of change of the CPI. So this Consumer Price Index is, in a sense, meant to be a measure of what's the average level of prices in the Australian economy. Now, so how do we do that? There's lots of things in the Australian economy. Do we count them all equally? Do we just add up the prices of everything and divide it by the number of things? Well, the answer is if you did that, then bananas would be just as important as housing. And a change in the price of bananas would affect the CPI as much as the change in the price of housing or something else that really matters. And so that's not what we do, or not what the ABS does. What the ABS does, it takes what's called a weighted measure. So housing counts for a lot more than bananas or Snickers bars. Right? Education counts for more than bananas, but not as much as housing. Fuel, transportation counts for more than education, but less than housing. So it's weighted by, in a sense, the importance that these things have in our budgets. Right? If the price of housing goes up, all Australians will be poorer, in a sense. If the price of bananas goes up, it's not going to have that big a deal. So the Australian Bureau of Statistics creates what's called this market basket. And it's basically just a way of lumping together prices. And what it says is, okay, well, 3 loaves of bread, 2 gallons of milk. It's meant to measure, in a sense, what an average Australian household consumes over a certain period of time. 3 loaves of bread, 2 gallons of milk, 1 pound of, or 1/4 kilo of butter, blah, 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 blah. A great big long list. And then the ABS then counts, well, how much would it cost to buy that? What's the price of buying that market basket? So the CPI, in a sense, represents the cost of buying the thing that the ABS says is, what's the average thing that people buy? And again, the problem is, likewise with cars in the 1970s and 2000, the sorts of things people buy isn't the same, right? If you looked and saw what people bought in the 1970s, and then look and see what people buy in 2010, it's very different, right? Mobile phone purchases in the 1970s were precisely 0. There were no mobile phones in the 1970s, right? Mobile phones started around the 1980s, and they were about as big as a loaf of bread. And so you were super cool if you got to carry around a mobile phone that was about as big as a briefcase. That made you cool. Watch those movies from the 1980s. It's very amusing. Mobile phones, VCRs, right? VCRs were a big thing in the 80s and 90s, but no one buys a VCR nowadays. DVD recorders, Blu-ray machines, right? Blu-rays didn't exist in the 1970s. So a whole lot of things don't exist at some point in time. They exist in another point in time, and then they've disappeared by some other time. So the ABS, what it has to do is basically adjust this market basket. Different things in there. Right? If you looked and saw what your average household bought in the 1970s, they probably bought a hell lot more canned pineapple. Right? Because most households don't tend to eat canned pineapple nowadays. Australians changed, right? How much garlic did Australian households have in the 1970s versus now? Well, exotic food in the 1970s was spaghetti, right? Spaghetti with a red sauce was kind of wog food. That was regarded as kind of exotic, Exotic Chinese takeout was sweet and sour prawns and butterfly shrimp, and chicken and cashews. So Australians had a very different diet back in the 1970s as they do in 2010. So over time, the ABS basically has to rejuggle what this market basket is. The ABS goes out there and it surveys households and says, what do you buy? What are the sorts of things that you're consuming on a daily basis? And then the ABS changes this market basket. So it's not the same. I think the book was saying it's on, the 15th different market basket. Every couple of years, the ABS just changes this thing because we're eating and consuming different things over time. So different types of goods are given different weights, again, depending upon what people are buying, and different importance. So housing is probably the most important. That's about 20% of the total cost of the CPI. So here again, likewise, this is from the Reserve Bank website. So what we're looking at here is different categories of things and different indices, average level of prices in each of those categories. So what you've got on the left-hand column here is all groups. That's basically our CPI. And then each one of these, food and non-alcoholic beverages, essentially it's showing a different average level of prices for each of these things. Then there's alcohol and tobacco, clothing and footwear, housing, furnishings, health, transport, communications, recreation, education, and insurance and financial services, banking, that sort of thing. And each of these things have an index. And as you can see, some things go up and some things actually go down. So if you look since about September 2011, so this time last year, actually the price of food has dropped from an index of 202 thereabouts down to about 196 now. So in the last year, the price of food on average has fallen. The price of alcohol has gone up from 309 to 319. So prices of some things rise over time. The prices of some things fall. What we're interested in is the average level of prices. Again, depending upon how important each of these different categories is, you get this most left-hand column, which is, in a sense, the weighted average of all the different prices in the Australian economy, according to how important they are in consumer household purchases. Oops, calculating inflation. So like I said, inflation is a rate of growth. So how do we calculate it? Well, there's an equation at the bottom there, basically saying it's, it's the change. That was wrong. I have to be careful about what I'm doing. Inflation, calculate inflation. Okay, so when we're measuring the growth rate of something, what we do is we measure the change in it, and we divide that by a level. So what we're thinking is CPI subscript 0 here just means some past level of CPI. CPI sometimes say last year. CPI 1 here represents, say, today's CPI, or the more recent one. So what we're measuring is the change between today and last year divided by the level of last year. So that's what that little equation down the bottom says. That's a growth rate. Right? If you wanted to measure the growth rate of a baby, what you do is you lay the baby down on the table, which is not easy, and then you measure the length of the baby. And then you come back a year later, and you put the baby down again, and you measure it again. And the growth rate is going to be the change in the length of the baby divided by, well, you want a rate, right? So, you know the baby is 2 centimeters longer today than it was last year, but you're not interested in the amount. You're interested in how quickly it is growing. So you have to divide that by a level. So you then divide the 2 centimeters by the length of the baby, and that gives you a growth rate. So that's what we're doing here. We're looking at the change in the level of prices, the CPI today minus the CPI last year, divided by the level of the CPI last year, and that's a rate. So that's giving you something like today's level of prices is 5% higher than it was this time last year. So here we've got, here's the calculations to do that. So what I've got here is the CPI from September 2010 up to June 2012, the most recent. We calculate a column to calculate the change in CPI. So from 1 September to the next September, 1 December to the next December, divided by the old date level. So since we don't have any values for September 2009 here in this table, we can't calculate a change, right? Because we'd have to say, well, the CPI in September 2010 is 173.3, less the CPI in September 2009, but I didn't copy that over in the table, so we can't calculate it. We can't get that numerator in the inflation calculation there, right? So what we have to do then is we have to go down to September 2011. So here now we can calculate the change because we take the change between 1 September and the past September. That gives us a value of 6.1. 6.1 doesn't mean anything because these numbers don't really mean anything either. They're just an index. Index numbers typically don't have any value in themselves. What we're going to measure is how much that rate of change is. So what we need to do then is divide this 6.1 by last September's level, 173.3. So we can say that the rate of change in CPI from September 2010 to September 2011 is 3.5%. So it's this last column that we're actually interested in. Likewise, the change from December 2011 to December 2010. Likewise, the change from March 2012 to March 2011. Likewise, the change from June 2012 down to June 2011. So we can calculate the rate of inflation. And as you can see, the rate of inflation in Australia, looking at these different months, it's the annual inflation because we're looking at the change between this year and last year, has actually been declining over time. I'll talk later about what that means. But it means that we might be concerned that actually that Australia is heading into a recession here. So the Australian inflation rate has been falling. But likewise, the inflation rate in Europe and in the US has been falling and sometimes negative, meaning those countries are in really bad recessions.